Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I am your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Joining us this week is Sebastian Stroud, a Ph.D. candidate in urban ecology and botany at the University of Leeds. Recently, Sebastian published a study with his colleagues detailing a growing lack of general public awareness of plants and plant species in the UK, and diminishing educational opportunities to study the field of botany. All of this, Sebastian argues, could be leading to an international lack of botanists and plant knowledge. Sebastian details why nature literacy and plant knowledge are so important, how we depend upon them for many of the products in our daily lives, and what the consequences would be for students, academia, the environment, and the climate if we fail to train sufficient numbers of new botanists for the preceding generations. Hi, Sebastian. Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast.
Hi, Mike. It's great to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So first, can you tell our audience what the work of a botanist is and why the field of botany is so important?
There's a really difficult question there. I think I'm going to be quite conservative in what I'm saying. So that actually, botany is a really broad field. So this is something that's come up quite a lot in the discussions around this paper of what is a botanist. And so in the paper that myself and my collaborators wrote, we put botany as being a really broad range of skills. And we slightly separate it from plant science, whereas a plant scientist could perhaps only work within cell cultures or only work on a very specific pathway in plant development or cell signaling. A botanist is a bit more of a holistic approach to understanding the world. So botany could be everything from taxonomy, understanding relationships between plants, through to ethnobotany, how do people use plants, how are they culturally significant, through to vegetation surveying and more basic vegetation ecology. Of course, you have botanical surveyors, so they would be specialists who go out into the field, understand your field sites, make recordings, observe them, report them back in kind of national nature monitoring projects. And then you might have academic or research botanists. So they might be those who work on more specific. So perhaps they're spatial modelers, perhaps they are soil biologists as well, soil fungal biologists as well. I'd say that fits under the realms of botany or a botanist. Some would say, and I think I'd probably agree, that it could be more or less anything to do with plants. So under that definition, I guess I wouldn't include some of those who work just on plant cell signaling and plant cell walls. But it's a can of worms, really. What is a botanist? It's not a simple answer.
Do you think you can add a little bit more into that, into why botany is important?
Plants are just so fundamental to processes on Earth. So, I mean, I was talking about this yesterday with some students, and we were talking about sustainable development goals. And there's a really fantastic paper by Apprentice and Papadopoulou. I think in 2020 they published it, and it links kind of all 17 of the UN's sustainability goals to processes that plants mediate. So we can think about plants in terms of how they support other organisms. So we know that about 10% of all plant species are epiphytes, therefore they live on other plants. We also know that plants provide our fundamental needs, oxygen, food, regulation of the biosphere, control of water quality, hydrological control. So we have a lot of problems here where I am in Yorkshire with flooding, and a lot of that is part of that is focused on upland management, where actually we've had really heavy grazing in those areas. So we get these huge downstream storm surges. So this is what we talk about in our paper, is that actually, whether or not you are a botanist, you know the plants that you use every day, but perhaps you just don't recognize it yet. So there's a really nice exercise that I do with my students where I ask them to think from the moment that they wake up in the morning to the moment they leave their door for work or house, how many plants or plant products have they used or seen? And really quickly you can build up a huge number. So I'm going to talk through my day this morning. So I woke up and I have some cotton bed sheets. So that's a plant product. I'm in a wooden bed frame. That's a plant product. I walk over to my shower and I'm using banana and guava hair shoe. That's another 2 plants. So we're on 4 already. And I'm barely even awake at that point. And then I've got a mint body wash. So that's 5. I'm using toothpaste. That's that's another plant-based product. And then before I've even got into my cereal, that could be there could be 15 different species that are being used in there if I've got a really interesting granola, not that I often do. And then from that onwards, you are constantly using plants, and they're always in your field of vision. And when you start to recognize that, you really can identify that kind of fundamental importance. And that's before we've even left the house and started walking towards wherever we're going. We could have 100 plant or plant products before, within 15 minutes of our day. And I think that sometimes we kind of forget that. So in terms of a human connection, they are we are completely surrounded by them and their uses.
That's a lot of products and that's a lot of implications. So why then is there a shortage of botanists, and why is this a uniquely bad thing? What are the consequences of this?
Yeah, so it's a difficult question, because actually within the paper, we don't necessarily talk about a shortage of botanists. There are still botanists out there, but what it is it's about plant awareness, and it's about people being able to recognize the kind of fundamental importance of plants, and particularly plants within regulation of the biosphere and global processes, but also local processes as well. So specifically our paper is about UK higher education, so within universities and within biosciences. But it's also related to kind of our whole educational system here in the UK. So I'm really lucky to have some great collaborators, and I work with lots of other people who talk about plant science and understanding of plants within primary, secondary and tertiary education. And we can kind of link some of this back to some work done by some US scholars. So Modesty and Schlusser, I think is how it's pronounced, but they were botanists and natural history educators, and they kind of first identified this phenomenon that they titled plant blindness. And so that kind of broadly is that we don't observe plants within our daily lives, so they tend to blend into, or it's perceived that they blend into the background for processes in relation to other biological processes, and that leads through to kind of a lack of understanding about their role in the biosphere and the implications of that, and that leads through to a kind of distinct illiteracy within the botanical and plant ecology sciences. So within the UK education system, we see relatively few mentions of plants within the curricula, and there are opportunities to explore them. But what we argue is because a lot of teachers who come through our education system are perhaps taught by people who are more interested or more confident about teaching about animals, something that we call zoo chauvinism within education, and they don't feel familiar and they don't feel able to teach about kind of some of the exciting and interesting species or processes that there are. And then this leads to kind of this feedback loop where if you're taught biology, you're more likely to be taught biology examples. Therefore, you're more likely to be interested in animal examples. Therefore, you're more likely to go on to study animals, and you're more likely to study animal processes. And all of that ultimately leaves us with fewer educators who feel really confident in educating about plants and plant processes. And then that drives that feedback loop over and over, fewer people who are able to teach about plants leads to fewer people who are aware and interested in plants, which leads to fewer people who want to go into education to teach about plants. And then it all continues. It's also likely here in the UK, one of our largest employers is the NHS. And so universities they're interested in getting students into jobs, quite rightly so. And so therefore, a lot of our biosciences degrees are quite medically focused, and that's what's been pushed in the curricula. And therefore, sometimes in the biosciences, natural history and identification skills are less frequent. And they're also sometimes more difficult to teach. If I want to do a really comprehensive plant identification module, I need at least a week in the field with students, and that has its own logistical challenges. Really valuable, but actually, if it's much cheaper to put students into a lecture room. You don't have to pay for a coach. You don't have to do health and safety assessments. And so that can lead to, again, this disconnect with the natural world, because hands-on teaching, good quality environmental education is really effective at teaching people. I think that's something that we often miss.
And I understand that your study focused on the UK and the UK education system, but is this also a global trend?
Yeah, definitely. So we've pulled examples from all over the world in it as well. So we've found that there was a study in South Africa, I forget the authors, but they identified that within science education textbooks, there were far more examples of animal processes and animals than there were plants. I think there have been some similar studies in the US as well. Globally, there's plenty of studies that demonstrate that most students, and we're talking generally university students, are not able to name more than a handful of their local species around them. And that's quite worrying, because what we want are plant-aware citizens, people who recognise the importance and the function of those within their environment. And we hosted a British Ecological Society sponsored workshop a couple of years ago in 2021, and we had academics and practitioners from all over the world, and all of us kind of that was what was the inspiration for this initial paper, was that they'd all identified that actually this was becoming a more pervasive problem. Students were coming in and they had relatively poor plant ecology and even just a poor understanding of plants generally.
And I do want to make a clarifying question. So earlier I said, why is there a shortage of botanists? And I thought I heard you say there isn't precisely a shortage of botanists, but rather there could be one. Can you clarify that for me?
Yeah, yes. So there's not that much data on it yet. I know that there's some work being done in the US now that's talking about how our botanical institutions are fulfilling these needs. There's also something called the Botany Bill in the US, and that addresses this, because actually in the US in particular, there's been more research on this. So they know that there is a declining, aging generation of botanists. So there definitely is nowhere near enough capacity to meet the requirements of various organisations and various statutory requirements. In the UK, we've lost an awful lot of our specialist degrees in botany and species recording. So recently we have had one of the kind of largest species identification degrees that's shut down. There's now only about one or two that run. So, and what we tend to find is that students here will do a little bit of perhaps plant ecology within their degree. They get hooked on that, and then they can then go on to do specialist courses. But what we're finding increasingly is that actually those specialist courses are not available. They're not attracting enough students. They're not seen as being financially viable by institutions, and so they're being cut. There are loads of plant-aware students. They tend to be quite disconnected. They tend not to have opportunities to engage with them, and that's the real risk. So yeah, we could be facing, a real decline in skilled botanists. And I think probably as we do more work on this, we're going to be talking to various kind of institutions, various organisations, ecological consultancies, and saying, okay, well, what other skills needs that you haven't currently got? I know here at the University of Leeds, we introduced a plant identification module because we had some of our best graduates going to interview at kind of regulatory bodies and consultancies. Then they were really good on theory, but the feedback that was coming back from their interviews was these students don't have the species identification skills we need. So we've got a really fantastic master's now that contains loads of strong identification. So we do 2 weeks and loads of different workshops and seminars with them on plant ID, and that's really valuable.
So how can this problem be addressed then? What needs to happen to get more people into botany? How do we increase botanical education and nature literacy?
I think it really starts with getting young people outside, exploring their natural environment, asking questions about the world around them. What is this plant? Why is it here? What does it do? What are its interactions with other organisms around it? We're here in the UK, we have quite a lot of things called forest schools. So children go out and they learn about the natural environment around them and they play. And that's a really powerful method for engaging students and children. Because we know that if you want to foster attitudes to protect something, people need to value it. And one of the easiest ways to get people to value it is to have those genuine, meaningful experiences. So giving children the opportunity to play and understand about the outside world is really important. And that's just not just for plants, but for all organisms as well.
I want to go back to a term you used earlier, and that is plant blindness. Can you explain this more? What kind of problems does this present?
Yeah, so plant blindness is somewhat seen as an outdated term now, so it's a disability metaphor. So some suggestions of alternatives we use is something like plant awareness disparity that was suggested by Dr. Catherine Parsley. I'm quite fond of raising plant awareness within students. So that tends to be what I use. So, how does the lack of plant awareness relate to and what are the challenges of that raise? If we think about I'm an urban ecologist. I focus mostly on something called nature-based solutions. So if people don't have a good understanding of the environment around them, then at least they're not being able to protect it. And so here in the UK, we have a lot of our cities are still very reliant on grey infrastructure. And so, things like urban forests are really essential for capturing carbon and also reducing kind of inequalities within different demographic groups. So it's really important that we recognize how valuable plants are so that we can enhance urban areas, so that we do things like reduce the urban heat island effect, which is this phenomenon where urban areas where there's a lot of concrete and buildings tend to be slightly warmer, and that can have some quite serious implications for both human health. We can use plants in a variety of different ways. So lots of green infrastructure. There's been a lot of work that talks about how trees and hedges and other types of vegetation can filter out particulate pollution from the air. Particulate pollution is a real driver of global respiratory diseases. So by people better understanding plants, they're better able to identify, areas around them that they might be able to have to enhancements, understand why these should be protected, push for legislation and push policymakers to make good decisions around urban planning, but also in conservation. I mean, one issue that we barely touched on here is climate change. In the paper we say that we ignore the opportunities of the botanical world at our peril. We have systems that have evolved to absorb carbon. Plants and peat bogs and species like sphagnum moss are incredibly effective at sucking it up. And so with good environmental management and with good policy that protects the remaining habitats we have, enhances those that are degraded, and restores habitats, we can make some really significant strides in reducing our impact on the natural world and achieving, a net zero world. And it's difficult, but, we have some of those opportunities there.
You did point out in your piece that botany has direct implications for climate change mitigation strategies. So where does the biggest potential lie, in your opinion?
That's a really difficult question. I'm not a climate change scientist. Within my own work, what we tend to focus on are things like, within a UK context, things like sphagnum moss within peat bogs. Sphagnum is a really effective storer of carbon. The way that sphagnum grows is that you have this tailing end that essentially sphagnum pumps out loads of protons, so it makes a really acidic environment. It also absorbs over nutrients and things and water. So you get this anaerobic environment that's really acidic. That means that actually you get very little microbial decay within that. So you get these absolutely immense stores of carbon. They grow really slowly. So it's about 1 millimeter a year or so, I think, is the kind of peat accumulation rate. Things like peatland restoration are a really hot topic here in the UK. A lot of our peatland is not necessarily managed for carbon storage. A lot of it's drained. A lot of peat was used horticulturally. We're moving away from that now. So things like protecting peatlands. We've seen a lot of challenges, less so now, but about 5-10 years ago, there were a lot of conifer plantations that were planted on peatland soils. And so conifer, initially you think, okay, great, tree planting, afforestation, fantastic for climate change. Actually, the wrong plant in the wrong place can do an awful lot of damage. You plant something that's quite thirsty on top of a peat bog, and it sucks up all of that water, dries up that peat, and actually releases more CO2 because it increases the microbial activity, and also you get the friability of the soil. So that's how soil blows away in the wind and degrades. So we've seen actually a lot of tree planting projects that have been completely inappropriate placed. And again, that's an example of that good understanding of those systems and the ecology of sphagnum bogs.
So what kinds of stories do you think help increase the interest in botanical knowledge?
So I think that there's some really fantastic stories from across the world. And I think it's about, if you can do something local that students can get out and see, that's really interesting. So here I do a lot of work on urban meadows. We have a plant here called yellow rattle, sometimes known as the meadow maker. What it is a hemiparasite of grasses. So its roots will actually attach to the roots of grasses and extract nutrients and steal nutrition and sugars away from them. And that reduces the vigor of those grasses, so you allow other species to compete with them better. And so stories like that are interesting. Students think, plants are kind of boring, they don't do anything, they're not as exciting as, lions hunting wildebeest in the Serengeti. Actually, they are. They're really fiercely competitive. They've got all of these different strategies for competing with one another. That you've also got really intricate plant-pollinator relationships. A really famous example is Darwin identifying, he predicted that there would be a moth with a particularly long species of tongue because he had found an orchid that had this incredibly long spur. as we knew, this will only be pollinated by a species that has this incredibly long tongue. Other things you can talk about are how sometimes actually, whole taxa have certain unique characteristics to them. So within a lot of dendrocarp forests in tropical Asia, so you have these forests in there, and the predominant species of tree are these dendrocarps. And interestingly, we see fewer kind of bird and mammal species within those forests. And what we also see is an awful lot of gliding species. So you might have heard of things like, gliding snakes, gliding frogs, gliding mammals and squirrels and things like that. And one theory was that actually these species need to be able to travel quite long distances quickly, is because dendrocarps are quite toxic. So actually that toxicity within their leaves might have driven this evolutionary response for species needing to disperse really rapidly and quickly so they can forage for long distances. So stories like that are like, oh, well, actually, the characteristics of a plant can drive the ecology of a whole ecosystem and drive the evolution of species. And I think that's really fascinating. And other things, we've also got a lot of rich folklore and history around plants. So I don't know if you have this in the US, but here in the UK, it's quite common to see an acorn-like shape at the end of your curtain rods, which is something you'd never think about. Well, how are plants related to curtain rods? But actually, oak was thought to protect you from lightning strikes. So there's this thought that actually people used to carve these acorn-shaped pieces for their curtain rods so that they protect the house against lightning strikes. And something that most students have absolutely never thought about, but actually are probably quite pervasive. Probably everyone's seen one. Everyone has a grandma who has these old-fashioned curtain rods. And yeah, actually there's reasons because it's rooted in our plant folklore and history. We could also think about things like plant names. So we've got a common dandelion in the UK, which is actually a huge selection of different microspecies, really interesting ecology there as well. They have a phenomenal number of names. There's like 50 or 60 different names for this, this similar group of plants. They're called, and that's also really interesting. So why do we have this regional variation in things as well? I think one of the names is like pisciflaps or something. Yeah. So, that's
a great name.
Yeah, it's a great name. Yeah.
So you mentioned about, plants interacting with fauna and just the general environment around them. So are plants smart or intelligent in ways that people can understand?
So intelligence is a difficult one. Plants behave, and in much the same way that you behave, it's just on very different timescales. So, if you say, I'm using some examples that, so Dr. Sandra Knapp is a fantastic taxonomist from Naturalist Museum. She did a really interesting interview recently for something called Botanical University Challenge, but she talks there about plants and plant biochemistry. And if you go home one day and you put your hand on a hot stove and you whip it away really quickly, that's still a chemical signal. When plants respond to stress, it's still a chemical signal in the same way. It just happens at a much slower rate, or sometimes not at all. We sometimes see plants that move really rapidly. Sphagnum. I love sphagnum, so I'm going to talk about sphagnum again. But if you walk across a bog in the summer, you'll hear all these little popping noises. Pop, 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 pop. And what that is that's the spore capsule exploding and sending out these spores at hundreds of miles an hour. So, plants do still behave. They still have characteristics. They grow towards light. They defend against predators. So we know that, when plants are grazed or damaged, that they'll emit certain pheromones which cause other plants to then upregulate their defensive compounds as well. So they communicate in that way. In terms of intelligence, it's not the same as us. They don't... I'm not a plant behavioral ecologist or anything like that, but they still do behave. I don't think it's comparable to how we as humans or other non-human animals behave.
I was going to ask you, are there any universities or departments that you see that are headed in the right direction in terms of fostering a new generation of botanists?
Here at Leeds, I've really tried to push for it. I'm only here for a little bit longer, so I'm not sure what's going to happen after I go, which I guess goes to show the scale of that problem. Who will take over this teaching? Frequently we've had people like Greg come down from Edinburgh to teach our botany courses here. There are definitely strides here in the UK to really push plant science and botany. So we have something called the Gatsby Foundation, and they fund an awful lot of outreach work. So they do work with schools, particularly primary and secondary. They also sponsor students to go and do placements. I am on a planning team for something called Botanical University Challenge. So we try and connect students with industry, with partners, just with each other to make sure that they know that there are students out here who are interested in plant science and botany. So we're trying to make real strides in that. There's other foundations like the New Phytologist Foundation that sponsor an awful lot of work and provide grants and training. Also organisations like the BSBI. In terms of universities, that's a landscape that we've not really covered yet. When we did our analysis, we found that there were relatively few modules focusing on plants. It was a little bit fuzzy because we can't go into every single lecture and find out, what's being delivered. That's a different project entirely. But what we found really worrying was that even within the plant sciences, there's very little on identification. And that might be because of different needs of industry. Again, they're focusing on plant genetics, plant reproduction, perhaps more of an agricultural biotechnology focus. So in terms of what's going on in the UK, I think it's a bit too early to say now. I know that we've got an awful lot of good horticultural institutions, and they tend to do a lot of good identification work as well.
All right, Sebastian, my last question for you is, what is your favorite plant and why?
I should have thought of this because it's such a difficult question. It always comes up.
It's really difficult to say. I'm a real sucker for aquatic plants. So I love things like bladderworts. They're predatory plants. They have these little jaws that snap shut to ingest kind of freshwater invertebrates. I really love species in the genus Monstera. I think they're really beautiful. I think they've got a lot of value. They're also quick and easy to grow, and I really love sharing plants with people. I think I'm going to go with the meadowmick. I think I'm going to go with yellow rattle, Rhinanthus minor. It's something that always makes me happy when I see it. It's got these gorgeous little bright yellow flowers, and if I see that, I think I've got a great quality grassland here. That's one of my favourite plants, and it's got a great story. It's parasitic, it's beating back these super competitive grasses, and I think that's always really fun to see. Well,
Sebastian, that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for chatting with us.
No, it's been great, Mike. Let me know if you've got any other questions, and if anyone wants to talk to me about plants, I'm on Twitter. It's Seb Botany. I'm always happy to field whatever you've got. And yeah, thanks very much for having me.
If you enjoy the Mongabay Newscast, we ask that you help spread the word by telling a friend. It's the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. You can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, and even just $1 per month will really help us offset the production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast. That's patreon.com/Mongabay. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either App Store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can always read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay, or on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Mastodon, where our handle is at Mongabay on all platforms. Thanks for listening.